Well, hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'll put my slides up in a minute. This is who I am, Art Krupicz. Um, we're going to have a pretty wide-ranging discussion. Unlike some of the talks in this series, this is more about state parks. I'll give the breakdown of what resources we have at parks and how I came to be here. I'll just let out a teaser now. I'm the first, or my position that I'm in is the first full-time position that Nevada State Parks has had, focused on cultural historic resources. So depending on your position, in a sense, that's wonderful. It might be horrifying that we're in 2022, is 2021, when I've been with parks for a while, and they've always worked with consultants and firms and things like that. So it's not that state parks wasn't meeting their obligations and all of that, but yeah, there's finally a full timer on board. So I'll get into that more a little bit later. I will jump into the slides here. And what I was going to say, or what I meant to say by all that is that yeah, this will be a pretty wide-ranging I'll just go here. This will be a pretty wide-ranging discussion. This is a summary here. First of all, I just want to thank Samantha, Rayette, their respective programs, and everybody here for coming tonight. It's nice to share some time and just share where I'm coming from and where state parks are coming from. Another little teaser, I guess, which we'll get to more at the end, but state parks is a big system, and we don't have a lot of our sites recorded. I mean, we know a lot, but we need a lot more info. There's a lot of things we know are out there, but we're not updated on their condition. There's things researchers can learn for the public, for future research, etc. So there's a lot out there, so I'll get to that. But anyway, thanks for having me. Yeah, tonight I'm not going to read this slide word for word, but we are going to go a little bit all over the place, a little bit on my background. I know those of you who log in regularly, or even if you don't, sometimes it's interesting to hear how people got into a field that isn't totally common, and that a lot of people think about. I've met hundreds, if not thousands, of people over the years, hundreds and hundreds will say I was going to go into archaeology, but I got nervous, or I didn't know if you make any money or what the jobs are, so they didn't do it. Fair enough. But anyway, I'll do a little bit about that. We'll go into fundamentals of archaeology. That sounds really heavy. I'm not going to lecture you, but I kind of want to go back to basics a little bit about why we're doing all this, what we get out of archaeology sites, and why the info is important. So a little bit about that, a little bit of state parks history, and then we'll get into the sites and what we need out there, which is quite a bit. Anyway, okay, so how do I become an archaeologist? How does anybody become an archaeologist? Well, in my case, it wasn't anything too special. I grew up in Pennsylvania, north of Pittsburgh on Lake Erie, Pennsylvania, steel belt town. It was great. I still go back to see family regularly with my kids and wife, and it was right on Lake Erie, so we have beaches. It's wonderful. But I wanted to, I don't know, I have folks who tell me I was a dreamer and I imagined a lot. It was an all of big imagination. I wanted to go out and try different things. And as I got older, I didn't think of it at the time, but I kind of wanted to go out and do things that I didn't see people doing where I grew up. I mean, that's all it was. It wasn't anything against where I grew up. It was just, I wanted to see more. I just always wanted to see more. So I went to college, didn't know what I wanted to do. And I finally figured out, I kind of not narrowed it down, but I got into, I'll be honest, I got into archaeology because after your sophomore year of college, you had to pick a major and stick with it. So I thought, well, I literally one summer was going through the catalog trying to figure out what would I want to do for 40 hours a week or more. And it was like, would I want to do this? No, turn the page. Would I want to do that? No, turn the page. And a few things caught me. And anyway, long story short, I settled on anthropology, which are in America, archaeology is under the discipline of anthropology. It's one of many kind of subfields of anthropology. So I did that. Then I got out with my anthropology degree, and I thought I was going to go study in the Arctic or the subarctic regions. I thought that was cool to I didn't even know what I wanted to study up there. I just thought it'd be cool to stomp around up there. And sure enough, with that reasoning, I didn't get into graduate school. So then I went off to a CRM firm, that's Cultural Resource Management. Some of you may have heard that or not, either way, but CRM firms kind of exist to to clear projects, which I'll get into near the end when I'm talking about parks directly. And so I did CRM. I realized I wanted to do more public outreach, work with the public. I kind of hustled for an internship at a museum. I did that. And then I got into grad school. I was able to get my master's degree, which kind of helps you set a reasonable career in archaeology. And yeah, I started in public outreach and public archaeology. In fact, my first kind of real job out of grad school was setting up the site steward program in New Mexico, or for New Mexico. We called it Site Watch. It's still called Site Watch, and they're doing what I'm sure some of you here tonight are doing. And it was a lot of fun. And then we ended up moving up to here. My wife is also an archaeologist. I'll mention her again a little later for a specific, for what she does. I'll talk about that briefly. Anyway, so here we are. We had kids. I was working part-time. I was the one who stayed home with kids. And then I started working part-time with state parks. I'm going on too long about myself, so I'm going to move on. Sorry. And then I was working part-time for state parks, and to their great credit, I was bugging them, and and really not some, all of the management understood that they really needed a full-time person. I was trying to keep track of their sites and all that in a more organized manner. And so they went out and asked the legislature, and it all worked out. So they have a full-time position. So I'm the lone, I guess, historic resources, cultural resources person for state parks. So I have 27 park units around the state, which I'll show you later. And I've been at it since last summer. So I don't know, about 6 months or so. And I'm just trying to get organized at the moment. And I'm thrilled to be here because I do need a lot of help. I need a lot of help from the public. I can't do everything with 27 units. If I had a team, and our rangers are great, they help me out, but we need eyes and ears on the ground. We need people talking about in the communities about what's out there at our parks and beyond our parks, but you get the idea, and I'll talk more about that later. Okay, so that's a little bit about me. Maybe you can compare, it might be interesting. I went on a little bit. I thought it might be interesting to compare and contrast my experience with what you may hear from other folks in the speaker series, or who you might work with if you're a site steward or something like that. So anyway, so now I want to spend a little bit of time on what archaeologists actually do. This is the fundamentals of archaeology that I was talking about earlier. That was an overly imposing title I put in the first slide. But anyway, oh, by the way, this photo is from New Mexico. This was an excavation in the late 90s and early aughts by the American Museum of Natural History. We were excavating a Spanish mission, a Spanish church that was established in the late 1500s, about 25 miles south of Santa Fe, New Mexico. The American Museum was excavating it to learn about it. I mean, in short, I'm there in the white in the foreground, right foreground. Yeah, we had a big crew for several years, and a lot of interesting things came out of there. It certainly has been an adventure. I've done, like, from the Indiana Jones thing, spiders on my, tarantulas up my legs, and my record for bee stings in one day happened in Vieques, on Vieques. Vieques is an island just to the east of Puerto Rico. I got stung 15 times in one day. That wasn't a very good day, but but it's been a wonderful trip and I enjoy it quite a bit. So anyway, but given all that, me or anybody else, what are we actually trying to do? So I'm going to go back to, I won't say first principles, but I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about what archaeology is trying to accomplish. And this is how I frame it. It's not, this isn't in all the textbooks exactly like this, but anyway, at the end of the day, archaeology is trying to learn about people. And when I say that, it's when we're excavating, when we're looking at things in the lab, when site stewards or preservation folks in any capacity, whether you're out on a site or not, if you're helping out, you're ultimately trying to save these sites so that we can ultimately understand real people from the past. So one way it's been talked about is that we don't think about things, about artifacts, we're thinking from them. We start at the artifacts. A lot of people will look at an amazing, a beautifully wrought arrowhead or a jar from the Middle East or what you name it. And a lot of people stop there. And the point of modern archaeology is you don't stop there. That's the artifact is the starting point. And what are the things you can learn from that artifact? Another way to look at it is we're going beyond mere appreciation to a genuine understanding. You can't always get there, but you try. You try to understand cultures we don't know anything about. And we also, and this is an important addition or add-on, is you try to understand cultures that we thought we knew, that we already know a lot about. So archaeologists are, to take both examples of each briefly, archaeologists are looking at sites, the people, how do I say it, for which we know nothing about the people. There are sites all over the world where it's a culture we know nothing about. We don't know what their symbols mean, what they could have meant to those people. Unusual tools, unusual architecture, etc. But we're also looking at cultures. There's a lot of work being done on ancient Egyptian sites, and we know a lot about ancient Egypt, but you can get a more nuanced view. People double, triple, quadruple check that what we thought we knew about ancient Egypt is really true, given new discoveries and things like that. So in a broad sense, that's what we're trying to do. Why does archaeology do this? Because I'll go through this quickly, but more or less, people have been looking at archaeology or at old sites, even before they called it archaeology. They've been looking at old sites for thousands of years. You may have heard that in ancient Egypt, again, archaeologists have found evidence that there were grave robbers breaking into the pharaoh's tombs thousands of years ago. So several thousands of years ago, the tombs were built. And then a few thousand years ago, people were trying to break in and get stuff. And then we come in and find evidence. It's like even the grave robbing is ancient. So anyway, so 1830s, give or take, is when kind of modern archaeology starts. I'm giving a really quick and dirty version of modern archaeological history. But basically, they start finding stone tools in the ground in France and England. And it spread beyond that eventually. But they start finding stone tools that clearly are human. And then you combine that with I don't know what you call it, realizations in the field of geology that generally younger soils are up high near the surface and older soils are lower, and they were able to verify that kind of thing. So long story short, archaeologists, or these early modern archaeologists, started realizing that humans may have been around a lot longer than major religions were saying. So for example, in Europe at the time, a lot of Christian faiths were saying, based upon readings of the Bible and whatnot, that the earth was about 9,000 years old. Well, long story short, archaeologists started realizing, wait a minute, if we're reading the soils and where these artifacts are and all that, people have been around for way longer than that. So much, much longer, tens of thousands of years longer. So archaeology, modern archaeology, came about because basically it started challenging the Bible. And you can't get much more serious than that. And I don't say that sarcastically. I mean, and this is something I'm going to get back to. Archaeology really speaks to people's identities, their sense of nation, their sense of person, their identities in a lot of ways. It speaks to the stories that we are taught and the stories we learn and how we make ourselves. So anyway, archaeology started challenging some of these long held beliefs. It didn't even mean to, in a sense, it just backed into it. So its methods had to get pretty strict or detailed or careful pretty quickly. Okay, so to move on, archaeology, our knowledge comes from the context of objects. Remember, we're trying to move from objects towards people. So that comes from context. And just a quick reminder, because I know it might feel for some like we're in the weeds here, but this is all what I'm talking about now is ultimately why we're trying to save sites and preserve sites, whether it's a building, some arrowheads, whatever it might be, because we can apply what we're going through here to these places. So anyway, context, the depth of an artifact. I kind of mentioned that a minute ago. The position of an artifact relative to other things. If you find something in an old ruin, let me back up. What you find in an old ruin, you can help delineate what rooms were used for what parts of life, you know, a kitchen versus a living room versus a basement versus, you get the idea. So depth and position relative to the things around the artifact, those are very important. We're trying to look at style, different styles of arrowheads, of pottery. We're looking at them, really, if we can get to it, we're trying to get the meaning of these things. That's a lot harder. But anyway, excavation, when you dig up a site, it destroys all this. It destroys, you can record it, and that's why we're so careful about recording things, the context of an object, because once you pull it up, it's never there again. So if you didn't capture something, it's gone. It's gone. So, and you may lose some information from that. Okay, so this is not like a print. You don't read this in all the books, but I picked it up over the years, and there's kind of, I think of it as 5 steps getting from objects to people. First of all, and I'll go through them fairly briefly. Step 1 is finding the artifact or the objects. So that could be artifacts, sites, features, whatever it may be. You do survey. There's all kinds of subtleties in survey. How much of an area you survey, how you survey it, how many people you have, what kind of technology you have, remote sensing, things like that. But you do survey and you carefully describe the objects that you find. So for example, this image shows what we would typically call an arrowhead, but remembering that we want to be careful. We could be bumping into people's stories, their identities. We want to get the past right, or at least as right as we can. And we want to be aware of what we know of and what we don't. So anyway, we don't call this an arrowhead because technically this sounds really picky, but we don't know that this fragment that's up on the screen, we don't technically know yet when we pull it out that it literally went on the end of a shaft that then was put in this contraption that has a bow and a string, and then they pull the string and make the shaft with that point, and it flies through the air like a bow and arrow. We don't know that it's actually an arrowhead. It could be put on a spear. It could be a scraper, a knife, a punch, as some artifacts are known. So anyway, we want to be very careful. So we call this well, we know now that it's probably a projectile point. So you may hear archaeologists talking about projectile points. If you read an article, it might say, you know, the letters PP, which is short for projectile point. So archaeologists, I guess that's an insider thing, but they don't use the term arrowhead for arrowheads. So there you go. But this is partly why, because we don't know exactly what we're looking at. So here's another example, more abstract. What is this thing? I was really bad because I used a picture without a scale even, but anyway, so you get these random fragments all over archaeology sites. So you don't want to guess. Again, the main things, you don't want to guess about this stuff. I mean, we could guess, and archaeologists way in the past would guess for sure, but we try not to, because we want to make our story or our information right as best we can. So let's go to step 2. We get data about the objects. This is basic observations, and they generally fall into 2 areas: the form of the object and the context. The context comes from the excavation. Or if you found it on the ground, you'd still know where it was. Hopefully you have like a GPS reader, or you can just do, you can at least put an X on a map. That's even helpful for context. But anyway, you also record its material, what material it is, size, shape, weight, as the slide says, etc. So in this case, I'll give some clues. The material on this object was lead. That gives you an idea. If you have a lead, we don't use lead anymore. Archaeologists can go back and figure out when was lead phasing out of building materials, of household materials. That already narrows it down a little, just confirming what the material is. You would weigh it, you'd get its dimensions. Again, I don't have a scale here, so you don't know whether this object on your screen is 6 feet long or it's 2 inches long. And in fact, it's only a couple inches long. It's like an inch or 2 long. Where was it found? In this case, it was found in a house. It was not found in like a privy or a garbage dump or an old ruin of a factory or a temple or anything like this. It was found in a house. You do some historic research on it. Are there any objects that have 2 drill holes like you see more or less in the middle of this object? You look at, that's one example of what you'd look for with research. You're looking at photos, descriptions, things like that. Once you narrow down maybe a time frame. I'm going through this quickly, but hopefully you get a general sense of what we're trying to do with these abstract objects. You also would look for, on this object, like, is there a finished edge? Like, is this really a torn or ripped or broken fragment, or is there like a finished edge to that? We do that a lot with pottery too. Anyway, then once you have some info, you go to step 3. Again, we're on 5 steps to get from objects to real people. So step 3 is low-level theory. You would try to explain the objects. Now you can say, well, maybe this object is an arrowhead. It was used, it was projected through the air via a certain device. Because if you can say it's a bow and arrow and it's a real arrowhead, that means they're hunting in certain ways or fighting in certain ways, and it gives them certain options if you have a bow and arrow that you do not have if you only have spears. Bow and arrows are much more advantageous in certain conflict or hunting situations than spears are. So if you can narrow it down, that's great. So what is this? This is and I'm kind of moving quick, so I could have built it up more, but anyway, we'll do that next time. A whirligig toy. A whirligig toy. Oh, I'll just jump to the next slide. This is a whirligig toy. This is me talking. It's kind of in the same family, I would think, as the old top, the spinning tops that you kind of pump on the floor and they'd spin, or a yo-yo. It's kind of akin to a yo-yo or a form of a yo-yo. Whirligig toys, as it turns out, were pretty popular up until the early 1900s. I'm not an expert on these, but radio and newsprint magazines started getting bigger, and as more media came in to the Western world in the late 1800s, early 1900s, these kind of faded a bit, but that's what it is. Okay, so what do you do next? Once you have a sense of what it is, step 4 is middle level theory. Archaeologists spend a lot of time on middle level theory. And this is very important because you go from the visible, what you have, to what it might mean about. This is where middle level theory is, where you make the real jump from an object to people, to a culture. So let's skip to the bottom of the slide here. You're basically saying, if this is here, if we have a whirligig toy on our site, then these people must have been doing or thinking X, Y, or Z. So So to be more detailed, a whirligig toy, what does it speak to? Well, it could, again, we're moving quickly here, but it could speak to how much leisure people have, what their schedules are, their daily schedules. Um, do they punch a clock at a factory or not? Even gender, like who works it. Now, I'm not saying that comes right from the whirligig toy alone. You're looking at a whole site, but it's part of the puzzle. And because it's a toy and people tend to use it for leisure, it's not a work item. You can start slowly, very slowly addressing issues like time and schedules and work and leisure, possibly gender, maybe down the road, even bigger things like religion. Once you get a sense of people's day-to-day schedules, what did it mean for them? What was motivating them to do that? And religion often comes into that. So middle level theory, yes, is very important. You can find this image here, you can find things and start to narrow down from their form, their context, et cetera, what these people who are no longer here and we can't talk to, and they may not even have writing, what was going on for them, inside of them, between themselves, et cetera. And of course, what I'm building to again is just that through preservation, we are really, in a sense, preserving the ability to do all this, which is why I'm talking about this now. Step 5, the last step, is what is generally called high-level theory. This is where you get to the big questions. Once you have lots of sites and you have a pretty good sense of what people were doing there, et cetera, you can ask things like, why did people in this region move from hunting and gathering to agriculture? Agriculture has big advantages, but it has some big downsides. So why did people do that? Why did people migrate from one area to the other? Why did they fight? Why did their religions change or evolve? You get the idea. You can ask some pretty big questions. Okay, so with high level theory, whirligig toy, you take the artifact, I kind of just mentioned this, but you take the whirligig toy plus other artifacts, features. If you have a written record, there's other methods, techniques that we're not even talking about, ethnoarchaeology, experimental archaeology, and you might be able to say who these people were, what can we accurately say about them. What can we say about people of the past? Well, archaeology, anthropology usually can't prove a whole lot. Some of them would argue with me, but generally the natural sciences can prove things. Social sciences, of which archaeology is a part, can generally suggest things. That doesn't sound great, just suggesting, but suggesting is powerful. You can really narrow down what was happening in a place, ancient Egypt, on a scatter of arrowheads, out in the Great Basin. You can narrow down and really get a good idea of what was probably happening. You can't prove it, but you probably can narrow it down. And then the humanities, law, arts, the arts are what most people think of. Those generally, as a general rule, they tend to persuade and move people, but they don't really prove anything. You know, a modern dance or a ballet doesn't prove anything to anybody. It's moving people, persuading them, getting them to reflect. Why am I telling you this? Because another quote, which I should have an attribution for, but it's one of those that just float around the discipline, is that archaeology and anthro are kind of in the middle of all this. They're very scientific, but they're also very humanistic. And hopefully you've seen a little bit of that already, that they're trying to use science and being very careful, systematic, using the scientific method, but they're really trying to find out about people and what people felt and believed and were passionate about, et cetera. So for that reason, as the slide says, it has been said that archaeo and anthro are the most scientific of the humanities and also the most humanistic of the sciences. And as I mentioned, the stakes really are high. I started by mentioning how archaeology it started by accidentally challenging the Bible, but it does challenge stories. You can read about how archaeologists tried to, they had, where do I start? They've changed the story on how slaves have been the slave life at different places in the Americas. So, for example, a classic example is Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, his plantation in Virginia. He had slaves. And archaeologists were able to excavate a lot of his slave quarters, or their slave quarters, and learn more about life of slaves and give a more nuanced study of that. I'm not going to go into that, but that's another example is the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer's Last Stand. There were very different stories if you talk to native descendants and then versus the common American history book story. And archaeologists tried to sort that out, and they did to a great degree. Not Again, they didn't prove anything, but they did clarify a lot of things. I'm not going to go into that either, but the idea is archaeology can be high stakes. And it is important, as I've already been saying this, but it speaks to people's identity, their legitimacy, their sense of community. You may have heard that the Nazis spent a lot of time doing excavations on ancient Roman and Greek sites, trying to forge a connection between the Third Reich and great and imposing ancient empires, and that the Third Reich was like an extension and had a connection to these great empires that everybody in the world already found impressive and admirable or in their way. So it could be used for all kinds of things. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, historic preservation is important because it allows, by going out, keeping an eye on these sites, advocating for these sites, finding funding to learn about these sites, you're literally allowing those 5 steps I mentioned, you're allowing them to happen. You're preserving stories, you're preserving identity, as it says here, you're allowing the creation of new stories and the refinement of stories so we understand the past better. And yes, as it says, everyone does need to get involved. It can't just be professionals. There's too much history, there's too much material culture, there's too much stuff in the ground for just the professionals to take care of it all. So we need everyone jumping in. Let me check my time. Oh boy. Okay. I'm going to switch over to state parks here. So again, I'm the historic preservation specialist. We're going to bring this back down to the ground. I do a few things. I clear projects. State parks we can't just put in a campground wherever we want. We have to make sure there's not an old site there. Or if we want to restore some of our old sites like Fort Churchill, we have to make sure we're doing it right. And we have to consult with people, tribes, communities, I won't go on and on, but yeah, we have to definitely consult, and we're a public agency and we have to make sure everyone's on board. I do inventories. I haven't been doing a lot of that. I've been doing a lot of clearing projects, but not a lot of inventories. What I really want to do is get out to our parks and see what we have. Like I said, we know a lot, but there's a lot out there still. And I also work on preventing damage, and also when damage occurs, responding to it, whether that's natural, human-made, whatever it might be. I assist the interpreters, and I do look for funding to keep this going. I'm only 6 months into it, but that's the idea there at parks. So we went a long time on archaeology, so I'm going to very quickly go through a little bit of background on state parks, and then we'll get to the kind of the climax here and what we're actually doing in state parks and what we need. Okay, so once upon a time, believe it or not, there were no state parks. State parks are just all nationwide are about 100 years old. The national parks are a little bit older. Basically, this is a very pat way to say it, but genuinely, America, there was manifest destiny. America's expanding from sea to shining sea, from coast to coast. And there was a huge push to do that, of course, in the 1800s. But once we got to the coast and we had this chunk of land, we're not going into how we got it, et cetera, at this time. But once we had it, what happens next? And again, jumping very quickly, our gaze kind of turned from acquiring land to maintaining it. And that's where national parks came in. Then you have automobiles. Automobiles allowed people to kind of pick their own adventure, pick where they want to live, where they work, how far from home they work, again, where they want to go for vacations, for trips. Automobiles really opened things up. So in Nevada, it started in the 1920s. They opened some recreational grounds and game refuges. They had about 15 of those areas. And the only one of those original 15 that's still with us is Cathedral Gorge. Cathedral Gorge State Park was one of those 15 original areas. And then just moving on, in the 1930s, the real state parks were assigned. Like, we started calling some of these areas state parks. It was motivated by the Civilian Conservation Corps, basically in the CCC. I won't go into that, but these CCC volunteers went all over the country. They helped build infrastructure in our public areas, but they said, if we're gonna help you build infrastructure in your state recreation areas, you have to make some kind of agency that's going to take care of them, and they don't fall apart. So on Easter 1935, Easter Day 1935, the State Parks Commission was created, and the first 4 state parks in Nevada were Beaver Dam, Cathedral Gorge, Kershaw, Ryan, and the Valley of Fire. And Colonel Thomas Miller from Caliente, he's considered the father of state parks, because he was on the ground overseeing a lot of that Conservation Corps work. And so for that reason, he earned that title. That's him there in the image on the screen. Okay, then parks shifted focus from after World War II. There was a shift in focus. I'm moving quickly. I want to get to what we're doing now. So you can see at the bottom, the visitation really exploded. The first year we recorded, well, I wasn't there, but the first time parks recorded visitation, 150,000 people came to our units. Then it was 1 million 11 years later. And then from 71 to 76, it jumped again to 2 million. So they were very popular. So now again, back up, there's a lot of sites in these places, etc. So anyway, and state parks has been dealing with a lot of technology. There's been a big rise over the last several decades of RVing, off-highway vehicles, electric vehicles, social media, mapping apps, and all that stuff. And as I mentioned at the beginning, parks did a very admirable job without a full-time person dedicated to it. And I think our parks are testament to that. But so now I'm in here trying to do as much as one person can. But again, that's why I'm here tonight, to just get you up to speed, because we have a lot to do. As I mentioned, we have 27 units. There, as I also mentioned, there's sites throughout every unit. As I was talking earlier, in the words I was mentioning earlier, those aren't just sites. They aren't just cold abstract sites. Those are places. Not all the sites, but many of the sites have real meaning to real people today. It's not just tribes. It's a lot of people, families connected to the early settlers in Nevada, people who just moved here, fascinated with history as we all are. But there's a lot of stories and identities that are attached or might be attached to a lot of these sites in the parks. And of course, just a quick shout out to Nevada. I've been all over the country and the Caribbean doing field work and whatnot. And Nevada really is, the Great Basin is special. You have low population density relatively, but over time you have very steady activity levels. At any one point, Nevada didn't have a lot of people, but there's always people moving across, going into deep prehistory. So you have a lot of stuff out there that people left behind, but there aren't a lot of big cities that are just overrunning this stuff. So we have a lot of things out there to learn from. And then you multiply that or divide it or whatever you want to do. But you multiply that by good preservation. You don't have a lot of, it's dry, it's etc. So you have a lot of things out there, and they're still here, and they're, for the most part, they're in good condition. So I don't expect you to read this. This is pretty small, but this is a map of Nevada state parks. And this is more for geographic distribution. We obviously have clusters around Tahoe and a little bit east, and we have an awful lot in Lincoln County, which is great, and all the rest are kind of spread out. We have a fairly good geographic distribution. Our newest parks are the Walker River State Rec Area south of Yerington, and the Ice Age Fossil State Park in North Las Vegas. Those are our two newest ones. Okay, so now I'll go through a little bit about the parks, and I want to watch my time here, and just a little bit about what their highlights are and what we need there, just very generally. So I'm going to start with the parks that are like outright built on history. They're not all called historic parks, but they have a lot of history in them. Other parks are more focused on nature, environment, etc. But Berlin is definitely one of them. Berlin is unique. If you haven't been there, it is more or less in the central part of the state, a couple hours east of Tahoe and Reno and all that. It's really neat because you have a ghost town that was built for mining in the early 1900s, well, late 1800s, and then was active to the early 1900s. You have a ghost town, and then if you go up the road, you have the biggest or most dense concentration of ichthyosaur fossils, which was a sea reptile, a prehistoric sea reptile. You have the densest concentration of a certain species of ichthyosaur in the Americas, possibly the world. I should know that by now, but possibly the world. It really is incredible. So there's a lot going on at Berlin. So you can do and in fact, you may have seen in the news that they paleontologists, it wasn't at Berlin, but the big ichthyosaur fossil just got moved to an LA museum and is under study now. Actually, that was found closer to Reno, but it's all part of the same field of study with Berlin. So you can do paleontology at Berlin, and you definitely can do archaeology. There's prehistoric sites. We're always maintaining this ghost town, the Berlin town site. We need volunteers. We will need volunteers eventually to help maintain these places. We'll need people to keep an eye on these places. Not so much the ghost town. I mean, the rangers are on the ghost town, but there's a lot of prehistory out there that hasn't been surveyed. And that's a theme throughout all of our state parks, is most of them have not been surveyed. Buckland Station, this was a stagecoach stop, a Pony Express stop. It speaks to the history of settlement in northern Nevada, agriculture, ranching, etc. We don't have a lot. We have volunteer docents and whatnot who can help out, although I defer to the park on that one. But we have a need for volunteers. But this is a small site, so it's not as sprawling in terms of our needs for volunteers, but it is there are needs there as well. Cave Rock on Lake Tahoe, very important to the Washoe people. And there's all kinds of stories around Cave Rock. This is a pretty small park. That's all of it in the image to the right. And again, to be honest, not a lot of volunteer needs right here, but it is based on history, and it could use advocacy and more, not so much on the ground, but more advocacy and support, funding, etc. Here and elsewhere. Elgin Schoolhouse in Lincoln County it was established to teach students from agricultural and mining towns in its region. And it actually ran up until the 1960s. The last class, I think it was an 8th grade class, graduated in the early 60s. I think it was 61, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, this is always needing upgrades and all that. And again, there may not be a big need for volunteers, but all these places can use help, and we can use assistance over time. So look out for that, and we'll definitely be reaching out. Fort Churchill, of course, it was founded or built in 1860 to basically to calm tensions between natives and settlers in the area. It's all adobe. Again, there's a lot of prehistory in the area that hasn't been, isn't fully understood for research, for the benefit of local tribes. There's a lot to learn there and a lot to keep an eye on. Ice Age fossils is our newest one of our two newest, as I mentioned, in North Las Vegas. Here again is paleontology, archaeology. It's a pretty sprawling area. We have a new visitor center that's going to open late 2022, as I understand it now. A lot to see there. There will be a need for folks out here. There's a lot of fossils. There's a lot of archaeology, as I said. So we definitely would need site stewards out here. We have folks working. We share this with the National Park Service. We have some folks out there now. Thank you, Samantha, and anyone else who's out there now, if they're on this discussion. Lahontan State Rec Area is tied to the Newlands project, which got water to much of northern Nevada and allowed for the Newlands project basically allowed for a lot of the ranching in northern Nevada, ranching and agriculture. Long story short, there's a lot of artifacts. I'm going to mention Lahontan again in a minute. Okay. I want to speed up and focus on some other things. So Mormon Station is another historic site, Old Las Vegas Mormon Fort. These areas all have things to need, volunteer needs, to say the least. Spring Mountain Ranch, another sprawling park just west of Vegas. All kinds of themes here. Ranching, celebrities owned the ranch for a while, various celebrities, a lot of prehistory, a lot of things to tease out about the past that we just haven't been able to do yet and that we're going to need help with. Same with Ward charcoal ovens, mining. Supposedly world mining is one theme and one area we could explore here. Supposedly Ward charcoal was a place for bandits to hide too, which I always thought was kind of interesting. But anyway, I think you get the idea there. And all our parks are built on history, really. This slide is a lot of words, but as I've been saying, prehistory is all through all of our parks, and we need to understand that better. I've mentioned settlement. These are some other parks I haven't mentioned. Beaver Dam, Big Bend, Rye Patch, Valley of Fire. They can speak well and clearly through the sites that they contain to the settlement of Nevada. Agriculture and ranching are big at Cave Lake and these Echo Canyon, etc. Mining at Dayton and Washoe. The Civilian Conservation Corps, how it played out in Nevada is at Cathedral Gorge and several other sites. So there's a lot of history everywhere. One thing I want to do too is work more with descendant communities. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but working with tribes, working with families who have a connection to early settlers. And again, even folks who are new to the state, but they have any interest, we need to learn a lot and we need to connect to the community. So that's like an ethic I want to develop in state parks, and the parks are supportive, but I want to bring that out more, just working with communities. Again, we're trying to go from objects and sites to people. So I want parks to be able to really connect our places that we're responsible for to real people on the ground, whether you have a familial or ethnic connection, or you simply really believe in preserving the past for all its reasons. We want to connect to that. Okay, so a couple of quick examples. Oh boy, I got to leave time for questions, but this is the cool part. Anyway, this is some fun stuff that we need to work on. Just two examples. At Lahontan State Rec Area, I mentioned Fort Churchill earlier, and it was built to calm tensions in northern Nevada between settlers and natives in the 1850s and 60s. Well, the tensions are what generally are called the Paiute Wars, and it was a series of skirmishes over a period of time between settlers and natives. And it started when some settlers from Europeans from this stage stop called William Station, which is well, I'll get to that. William State, where it is part of the problem. But anyway, some settlers went out, and varying accounts. They kidnapped some Paiute women. They raped them. To be honest, it varies, but it wasn't good, to say the least. And the Paiute retaliated. They retaliated by going to William Station and killing everyone in it. It wasn't it was like a stage stop. It wasn't huge, but then, so that initial action by the settlers, a retaliation by the Paiutes, that led to the forming of a militia, and calls for more military intervention. And there were a series of skirmishes that eventually calmed down when the Fort Churchill was established. That's the very fast version, mind you. But at Lahontan Rec area, as you can see in this photo, I mean, you may, to explain the photo, what we are looking at is the dry lake bed of Lahontan Reservoir. The reservoir has been around for about 100 years, and it's gone dry a few times, maybe every 40 years it's gone dry. But given the environmental conditions of the last few years, it has actually gone dry twice in the last 2 or 3 years. And when it went dry, the rangers noticed, actually the ranger on the right there in the center right, he went out, he had to get a boat that was sitting out, like a rowboat that sank, and he had to go pull it out. And on his way out, he found this stone foundation to a building. So that was uncovered when the reservoir dried up. And he called me out, we checked it out. I wrote up site forms on it, etc. I overlaid in GIS, I overlaid old like late 1800s topo maps that had buildings in the area, that named buildings in the area. I overlaid it, and this building was not on any of the old topo maps. So it seems to be something, but we don't know what it is. It wasn't, we were hoping it would just be a name on a topo map, and that would give us a clue, but there wasn't. So anyway, so and then we found other foundations as well, a few others that are now, Lahontan is filled up again. But we have these structures that we don't know about, and they might be William Station. That's the other thing. We don't know where it is. We never knew. Nobody knew exactly or for sure where the real William Station was. So this actual foundation in the image doesn't seem to be it, but anyway, based on what I can tell and interviews I've done, but we're not totally sure. So we need help with that. We need help. Don't send me a million emails right now, because it's covered up. But I mean, you're welcome to contact me anytime, but we eventually, pretty soon, we are going to need help figuring out where William Station is. So actually, you can go ahead and email me as much as you want, and it might take me a while to get back to you with my current workload, but trust me, this is one of the fun things I want to figure out for the park, for the community, for Nevada history, etc. Okay, and then I'm almost done here. Up at Lake Tahoe in the Spooner Lake backcountry, there were a lot of flumes up at Lake Tahoe tied to the mining era that we call the Comstock lode in Virginia City. Well, Virginia City, all the mines were powered by wood from Lake Tahoe, and they got them down there, as you can see in the black and white image on the left, through flumes. And we have them, as you can see on the image on the right, we have flumes up there, and people are cutting illegal trails up there, which we really want to discourage. So we're trying to figure out how to balance this. There's a lot of people hiking, biking, etc., but they're going into areas we really want to preserve. So we're trying to figure out how to balance all this. And we're going to need volunteers to help depending on which way we go and how we preserve it. We'll need help with preservation, site monitoring, funding, advocacy, etc. So these are just a little more detailed examples. So Nevada has about 148,000 known sites in their official database. I mentioned my wife earlier. She runs that database. She told me the other day that's how many they have about right now. As I mentioned, the state parks are largely unsurveyed. We're gonna, I hate to say hide, but we're gonna Not all sites are going to be open to the public as we learn about them, but we do need to keep an eye on them. We're going to interpret many of them, and we're going to try to protect as many as we can. As I mentioned, inventory, just surveying, monitoring, funding, people, getting the word out that, if telling your family, friends, coworkers, if you're out on a state park or anywhere and you find arrowheads, please leave them where they are, because we lose context if you don't keep them where they are. If you move them, we lose the context. So that ethic of how to preserve things, that's very important. That's something you can start right away. And as I've already been saying, we want to involve citizens and residents, visitors as much as we can. I can't do this alone. The parks are huge, and it's great to do it together. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to any questions, and yeah, talking to any of you. You're all welcome to contact me anytime. Thank you.